What does it take to be an amazing data analyst? Is it writing good SQL code that's clean and efficient and easy to read? Or maybe it's about making super sleek Tableau dashboards. Well, believe it or not, it's neither of these things. Stay tuned because in this video, I'm going to teach you a framework that you can follow to become an amazing data analyst. Let's get started. I've been a data analyst since 2015, and I can definitely say that while it's important to have a good grasp of the technical skills, I would argue that what separates good data analysts from amazing data analysts are not so much the hard skills, but the soft skills. One thing I have noticed in the many interviews I have done throughout my career is that there's always one question that gets asked in particular, and it might be something like, describe your communication style with your stakeholders, or how do you work through a project from start to finish? And there's a reason this question gets asked all the time. It's because while 80% of the time you might be working on the tech for your customers, all that time will be wasted if you don't even get the request right. The whole reason our profession exists is because we need to use data tools to solve problems for our customers. So when thinking about how to become a data analyst, yes, it's important to learn hard skills like SQL and Tableau, but these are skills that are easily learnable. Soft skills like communicating effectively with your customers are not as easy to learn. Soft skills often come with practice and experience, but there is a trick you can learn to accelerate your mastery of this skill set, and it's called SDLC. SDLC stands for Software or System Development Lifecycle. So what is it? Well, think about someone like a customer or business partner that has some technical need. SDLC is a framework for a developer or a team of people meeting with the customer, figuring out their problem, and then building some solution. It's a framework with multiple stages, and it's often used in IT settings. Keep in mind, though, that there are different versions and implementations of SDLC depending on who you ask or where you work, but I'm going to keep it really simple. You can think of this as a 5-step process. Step 1 is requirements analysis, where you work to get some understanding of the problem. Step 2 is design, where you try to understand the solution. Step 3 is build, where you take a first stab at the solution you're trying to create, after which you do some testing. Step 4 is deploy, where you officially launch the product for widespread use. And then step 5 is support, where you solicit feedback to make the product better with future versions, if applicable. So for example, let's say you're a solo web developer and you have a new customer who runs a landscaping business. Maybe they get their customers entirely through word of mouth at this point, and they want you to build a website that showcases their best work to potential customers and lists out their business contact info. So here you might be handling all of the SDLC steps on your own. Now let's consider a different example. Let's say you work at Google and you're trying to help improve their search engine. Well, that could affect millions and billions of people. So they're going to have a ton of experts in lots of different specialties working on something like that. Project managers, web developers, software engineers. In this case, you would probably end up being a tiny, tiny cog in the SDLC cycle. The point is, SDLC is a framework for supporting the customer and their needs. Your involvement in the SDLC will vary depending on where you work, as well as what you are supporting. And if you get good at SDLC, your customers and your boss are going to love you. So what does this look like for data analysts? Well, your mileage may vary, but as a data analyst in a hospital, I often handle a lot of these steps on my own as I speak with the stakeholder. So I'll show you what this looks like by diving into each step. In the requirements analysis step, you are listening to the customers or your stakeholders and figuring out their problems. This can take different forms, but the most common request I get is building some sort of dashboard with various metrics to help the customer understand how well we provide patient care in the hospital. Whatever the case, you are taking note of the needs that the customer has. You're also going to be learning a lot about the business practices. Certain keywords or business jargon might be used, as well as metrics that are specific to the customer. Whenever I hear these keywords or metrics or jargon, I always ask the customer to educate me about what those things are if I don't know already. So here's an example. A few years ago, I was offered a job at a major hospital in Seattle, and going into that job, All that I knew was that I was going to be a dedicated data analyst for the dialysis unit of the hospital, regularly supporting their data needs. In the first week of that job, I set up a meeting with the service line manager. In that meeting, I learned that the person that managed that department was required to submit many reports to CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They needed to submit things like the number of regular patients who had hemodialysis versus peritoneal dialysis each month, or what percentage of the dialysis patients reached a target range for their lab values like calcium, sodium, iron, albumin, or how many of their regular dialysis patients missed a particular treatment, among many other things. They were relying on manual reports that they had to generate in a certain way from various different business intelligence systems. And they were dumping all of that information into an Excel document that had to be formatted in a certain way, and that added up to be about 40 hours of manual work per month. So in that first meeting, we talked through their needs, which was basically to build them a Tableau report that pulled all of this data for them regularly so that they didn't have to spend hours of work each week pulling the data manually. They had a whole laundry list of different pages to the dashboard they wanted me to eventually build out. But I knew that to fully meet their need, I would first need to write a somewhat complicated query that determined who the dialysis patients were and how we defined them. So I asked a lot of detailed questions like, do you have example patients I can look at to get a better understanding of how dialysis patients are defined? Or do you have specific billing codes or diagnosis codes that would help us differentiate between hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis? These are both examples of inclusion criteria. I also asked them, are there certain dialysis patients that we are not interested in? This is called exclusion criteria. So for example, I later learned that they were not interested in tracking dialysis patients who had successful kidney transplants. They also wanted to filter out patients that were not regulars, which they defined as those getting temporary treatment because they were from out of town, visiting friends or family, and just required short-term treatment and not long-term treatment. Over the course of a few meetings, we defined the business logic for how they wanted me to define dialysis patients. This would be important because it would set the stage for all the reports that I would eventually build for them in that dashboard. Step 2 is design, which is all about designing solutions. Usually I will discuss solutions in the same meeting as the requirements. I give them a high-level plan of the work that I will need to do to deliver a finished product. I might also start making my own notes about how I'm going to retrieve that data. In my case, working in a hospital, I often have to pull data out of an electronic medical record or EMR system. The typical EMR system that I use is called Epic, which contains tons of information, and that data can live in a lot of different places. So if I'm unfamiliar with where the data lives, I might ask the customer to pull up example patients in the EMR system. By seeing the patient's chart, I'm usually able to reverse engineer where I can retrieve that data from our SQL database. Lastly, if I'm building some sort of data visualization, like in Tableau, I also like to ask the customer if they have any vision for how they want the data to be graphed. Oftentimes, the customer isn't sure and they'll just defer to me. In which case, I might start drawing pictures, either on paper or on something like Microsoft Paint to get a rough idea of how we might display the data once it is in a final data extract. Once I'm done with step 1 and 2, I'm at the point where I have a pretty good understanding of what the person needs. I know where to pull the data from, I know what the process will entail, and I will have communicated the process to them. Usually the process will look like this. First, I build a data extract, then I have them validate that, then I build a dashboard that has all the features they need using that validated data extract. And I'll also provide time estimates where available. So returning to my dialysis example, I worked with my customer to get a good understanding of how we were going to define the dialysis patients. Then in the design phase, I talked about how I would need to pull a list of dialysis patients according to our business rules that we established. They would then validate those cases and make sure they were correct. Then I would finish by deploying a Tableau dashboard. I also started sketching out some ideas in Microsoft Paint to give them an idea of how we could visualize our dialysis volumes, as well as bring in other future additions to the dashboard so that they would get a pretty clear understanding of what we were working towards. Independently, I also started researching where the dialysis data lived in our database so that I could start building it for them. Steps 1 and 2 are really going to set the groundwork for how successful you are in later stages. And as you progress into further stages, don't be afraid to revert back to an earlier stage if you feel like you need extra clarification or focus. The first 2 steps are so important, I'm going to share with you some pro tips. Ask lots of questions. Questions are crucial to understanding the need, what the project will entail, and how it needs to be built. Repeat back the things that you hear to make sure that you are on the same page as the customer. This also shows that you are actively listening and genuinely care about the request. If you get stuck on something technical and can't figure out what they are trying to communicate, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. Try drawing something out to see if you can come to a visual understanding of the request or the technical concept that you need to wrap your head around. Sometimes I'll use Microsoft Paint during a Zoom call. Lastly, when estimating how long it will take you to do a project, try to under-promise and over-deliver. If a customer requests X, Y, and Z by a certain date, don't be afraid to be realistic with them and tell them that you can only do X and Y by that date. They will usually be very flexible. Worst case, it will be easier for you to meet those requirements by the deadline and they'll see you as a reliable data analyst. But in the best case, you may have ended up overestimating the effort involved and end up giving them X, Y, and Z anyway, in which case they will see you as someone who goes above and beyond for them. Now at this point, I'm going to take a short break and tell you about my free 1-hour Pivot into Clinical Analytics webinar. If you want to become a clinical data analyst but don't know where to start, I break down all of the things you need to know to go from 0 to hero in the span of 10 weeks, all for free. This includes a SQL curriculum, a Tableau curriculum, and how to acquire healthcare knowledge for free. Last but not least, I show you how to fast track your job application process by networking. Networking is one of the most important things you can do for your career to land a job as a data analyst. And it's actually not too difficult to do, especially with websites like LinkedIn. So in this webinar, I show you some of my favorite networking secrets to accelerate your job search. The webinar is offered twice daily, and if you miss it, that's okay because I'll send you the recording later. So if you're interested in signing up, you can go to datawizardry.academy, click on resources, and then click on Pivot into Clinical Analytics webinar. Or you can click the link here in the video or in the description below to sign up. Now let's get back to the lesson. In the third step, which is build, you're actually working on some functional code or product that you can show to the customer. And this is where you really want to test the thing that you are building. If it's untested, you might run into some bugs later on, which could cause your customers to start losing confidence in you. Now, for most of my projects, I'm writing some SQL code to build an underlying data extract that will be used for a data visualization, like in Tableau or Power BI. So I'll first build the extract, then I'll provide a sample of the data to the customer to review for accuracy. If it looks good, I move on to building the Tableau dashboard. If the SQL extract doesn't look good though, the customer will give me that feedback. That feedback might be bugs that they find. Maybe I'm pulling too many cases that shouldn't be there. Maybe I'm pulling too few cases and leaving out cases that should be there. Maybe I created a column in my data set with some incorrect logic. Whatever the case, I review that feedback with the customer and revise it until we get it right. Once the data extract is finished, I'll usually plug that extract into a data viz tool like Tableau to start creating a dashboard of metrics. So continuing with my dialysis example, I put together the rules that me and the dialysis manager brainstormed into a SQL query and then pulled up a list of dialysis patients. They also shared with me their Excel document of dialysis data that they had been maintaining manually that we were trying to replace. This was their source of truth. It had a monthly list of their official dialysis patients. So I set up a meeting for us to compare my results to the manual Excel workbook. And we found that sometimes my list would be missing key cases that they had on their list, and sometimes my list would actually have key cases that they didn't have. So this revealed two things. One, that my code would sometimes miss crucial cases and that I was missing key business logic that needed to be added or tweaked in my SQL query. And then two, sometimes they would mess up in their manual process and not properly include cases that should have been on the list. We went through this process of validation 2 or 3 times to refine our business rules for defining our dialysis patient population until it was perfect. At that point, I wrapped things up by plugging that data into Tableau. I created a dashboard that automatically monitored our dialysis census data each month, and they loved it. So I didn't have to make too many revisions to the dashboard. So you've reached the point where you built a finished product. It's been validated by your customer, so they not only trust the results, but they're also satisfied with the results. Now you are ready to put it into a live environment where the report will automatically update every day. At this point, the customer will have access and can start using it. And usually, if the customer base is excited enough about it, news will spread quickly, and pretty soon more people will request access to the report. To me, this is the most exciting part because your customers are going to get excited about it. In the case of the dialysis dashboard that I worked on, I managed to completely replace their old manual way of tracking down dialysis patients each month, saving them hours of work. And it laid the groundwork for automating even more work for them to make their lives easier. Once you reach the maintain phase, you're basically at the point where you could implement updates to the product if it's a high enough priority. So you might find yourself having occasional meetings with the customers where they say, gee, I really love these things about the dashboard you just built, but I would love to add some extra features. At that point, you might launch into a whole new cycle and repeat the process to get a version 2 of the product, or a version 3. In my dialysis example, version 1 was simply building a starting point where I could list out who the dialysis patients even were and how many dialysis patients we would treat on a month-to-month basis. After I built this for them, they wanted me to add a page to the dashboard that looked at those patients and tracked those that missed their appointments. That would become version 2. And I would go through the full cycle again to make sure I was accommodating exactly what they needed. Then in version 3, I went through another cycle where we worked out another page that tracked what percentage of those patients reached a target lab value each month. Over 6 months, I went through several new versions of the dashboard and had several cycles until I basically delivered on all of their requests. And therein lies the central premise of being a data analyst. Your value isn't necessarily to write code or to build super cool dashboards. The value that you bring is your ability to meet with your customers, figure out their problems, pick the tools necessary to solve the problem, and then build it. On a different note, in a previous video, I talked about how data analysts sometimes get concerned about the rise of generative AI like ChatGPT taking our jobs, but if you can follow SDLC and work with your customers effectively, I don't think that ChatGPT is going to be taking your job. ChatGPT simply follows commands, often without questioning you. But when you're a data analyst, your job is to ask lots of questions and to work closely with your customers so that you can ensure that you are getting the request right and delivering exactly what the customer needs. Now, I've talked a lot about the soft skills of data analytics, but if you're interested in knowing what it's like to be a clinical data analyst, check out this video where I give you a day in the life of my work. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.